Okay, so welcome to the event, and I'm really happy to see two of my friends here joining me tonight. It's 8 o'clock in the evening in Japan. Is it 1 o'clock in Central European time? Looks like a very warm day. And we will be discussing the recent application of Sweden and Finland to join NATO. With us, introduce first of all Professor Dr. Thomas Jonta. He's a professor and director of the International Relations Department at Stockholm University, Sweden. His research focuses on nuclear non-proliferation and energy security. Amongst others, he has published the book, The Key to Nuclear Restraint, the Swedish plans to acquire nuclear weapons during the Cold War. I would also like to add that in our group's discussion paper, we have a short piece by Professor Jonta, which is translated into Japanese on Sweden's effort or attempt to acquire a nuclear weapon. And then we have Mr. Tapio Juntunen, university instructor in security studies at Tampere, Finland. He researches the effects of Cold War nuclear weapon policies on Finnish foreign policy and the history of Finnish foreign and security policy. And in addition, we have as commentator, and most of you know Pascal Lotta. Dr. Lotta is adjunct researcher for neutrality studies at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study, and also adjunct professor for European politics at Temple University, Japan campus. He edited the work Neutral Beyond the Cold. And I would like to add that he is one of the group's alumni. He finished a PhD here at group's SISP. And so he's one of the family here. So we would like, first of all, to ask Thomas Jonta to speak for about 20 minutes about Swedish neutrality and about the recent decision to apply for membership in NATO and what kind of implication that will have. So without much ado, Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joko. Do you hear me? And do you see me? I hope so. Here. If I could do like this. Oh, here we go. So it's you're absolutely right. It's 1 o'clock or 5 minutes past 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Sweden, and it's not warm here. It's 17 or maybe 16 or 17 degrees, and it's raining. So it's not a warm summer weather here. But I'm glad to be here among you, and I'm going to give you a brief presentation. As all of you know, Sweden, together with Finland, NATO about a month ago. And this is something very, very new and very much a big change for all Swedes, because we have had a so-called to use neutrality, because here in Sweden we often use the term non-alignment or alliance-free. But I come back to that because the Swedish with other European countries such as Austria and Switzerland. Anyway, but it's been a big, big change, because nobody believed, I would say, at least a year ago or half a year ago, that Sweden should submit a NATO membership, because we have had this non-alignment policy in effect more than 200 years. And it's been a part of our DNA tradition, our mentality. Sweden should always stay alliance-free or non-aligned. But to give you the background here, I think we have to go back in time a bit. But I will start with comparing the Swedish, so to speak, neutrality policy with Austria and Switzerland, because Austria and Switzerland, they have a permanent neutrality status, which is not the case of the Swedish neutrality policy over the last 70, 80 years, and even before that. But I would stick to the post-Second World War here to make it more easy for you to understand. So the Swedish neutrality is not a permanent, was never a permanent neutrality. It was based on what the government declared the Swedish foreign policy position should be. And as long as this position was recognized by other states, we were considered to be a non-aligned country with the aim to stay neutral during a conflict, a military conflict or a war. So the Swedish non-alignment policy is much more flexible than if we compare with Austria and Switzerland, because for example, Austria is part of the constitutional law, which is not the case. It's not a difficult case to submit a NATO membership for Sweden. But let's go back to the Cold War, because the modern version of the Swedish non-alignment policy evolved during the Cold War. And then the position was formulated like Sweden's security policy should be free from alliances in peacetime, aiming for neutrality in war. So as long we don't have any war, we stay as an alliance-free state. But if the world or the neighboring countries are running into a war, we will declare us neutral, so to speak. And the non-alignment policy during the Cold War evolved, as I said, and it had a couple of, I think, important to know a little bit more about to understand what is happening today. First of all, during the Cold War, the Swedish non-alignment policy was, so to speak, argued to defend and support a small state perspective, creating a peaceful and a fair world order, a so-called third way between US capitalism on one side and Soviet communists on the other side. And from the beginning of 1960s until the end, not really in the end of the Cold War, but I would say until the mid of 1980s, a so-called active foreign policy was pursued, where Sweden should act in certain way as a bridge builder, as a moral critic, if other states are behaving in a bad way, and so on and so forth. So that the argument went during that time was the best position for Sweden. And as you know, we didn't join NATO in 1949, while our friends and neighbors, Norway and Denmark, joined NATO. So we stayed out. But the reason why we could stay out, so the argument went in the end of 1940s, in the beginning of 1950s, is that we will create a strong national defense based on a Swedish defense industry, building Swedish naval vessels, fighters, all kind of weapon systems. And in the end of 1950s and during 1960s as well, the defense system of Sweden covered about 3 to 4% of the GNP. So it was based on a very strong defense. And out, Sweden was able to mobilize soldiers. So that, I think, is a very important background here. Because after the Cold War, we in Sweden and in many European countries thought that the eternal peace has arrived. It won't be any more conflict with Russia and the Eastern world, so to speak. Now we're going to build a new security architecture. And that meant, from a Swedish perspective, that the neutrality as it was interpreted during the Cold War doesn't exist anymore, even though it took several years for the different governments in Sweden, so to speak, to back down from the neutrality. In the beginning of 1990s, in different foreign declaration, it said that the Swedish position is alliance-free, with the aim, possibly, potentially, to stay neutral in times of war. But suddenly, the neutrality option disappeared. And now, and since 8-10 years, the position is formulated as military non-alignment. Military non-alignment, meaning that we can, if we think it's needed, to enter security agreements with other countries, which was not possible during the Cold War. So it's been a more room for maneuver since the end of the Cold War. I'll come back to that later on. And because of this new situation after the Cold War, Sweden applied for a membership in the European community that turned into European Union. And we became a member of 1995. And we, since the end of the Cold War, step by step, have entered a closer cooperation with NATO, different kind of projects, cooperation with NATO. So once again, neutrality has been played down step by step. So now the position is military non-alignment. But something happened. Sorry, it's a misspelling here. In 2008, when Russia attacked Georgia, it made the politicians to think about Swedish defense capability, if it was a very good idea to scale down on the defense. And especially when Russia, the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, it sent shockwaves through the policy establishments in Sweden, and with the consequence that the Swedish defense capability has to be upgraded. And of course, as a member of European Union, there is certain security cooperation ongoing, but these cooperation and the so-called security guarantees that some documents are referring to has not been seen as sufficient, given the new position of Russia, more aggressive policy by Russia. So after 2014, after the Russian annexation, the Swedish government have approached different Western states, such as United States, Finland, United Kingdom, France, and a couple of others, and entering different security agreements in order to strengthen the Swedish military capability. Because since we don't have and didn't have a strong defense, because it was scaled down after the Cold War, step by step. So the argument went, we need security agreements and some kind of security guarantees from the United States. That was the arguments after 2014. And the leading politicians, especially among the Social Democrats, today we have a social democratic government. They supported very strongly the military non-alignment policy. But step by step, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party and the Christian Democrats start to argue that Sweden needs to join NATO. But the position of the Social Democrat since 2014 until a month ago has been, no, the non-alignment policy has served us well. And there's no reason that we should apply for a NATO membership. We have security agreements with the United States. We have certain kind of guarantees, security guarantees, especially. But as you know, 24th of February this year, the Russian attack and war with Ukraine changed everything. And especially so in Sweden, when Finland started to move towards a NATO membership. And this is very important, and we will probably hear this more about this from the Finnish point of view. But for Sweden, Finland has been a very important cooperative partner. We stay very much in close cooperation operationally with the Finnish NATO. It puts Swedish in a very awkward situation because if Finland would join NATO, that was taken for granted more or less from the Swedish perspective. Sweden will be the only non-NATO state in our area, in the Baltic Sea area on the Western European side. And so on, so the argument went. And here it's so important to understand historically as well that Finland and the Finnish position has been so important for the Swedish security policy, because during the Cold War, one to consider Finland, because Finland had this agreement of friendship, cooperation, and should join NATO during the Cold War. So the argument went. That would put Finland in a very, very vulnerable situation. So one of the arguments against NATO membership during the Cold War, and until now, I would say, has always been because we are sensitive what will happen to Finland if we face an aggressive Russia. So after the Russian attack in the end of February this year, it started a big discussion in Sweden among political circles in Sweden. And the Social Democratic Party in the end changed their view. And they had an internal kind of investigation, an internal discussion in the party, and they came to the conclusion in mid-May 2022 that the best option for Sweden would be to join NATO. And in May 18, Sweden and Finland submitted their application to NATO. Okay, I understand there will be a lot of questions, but if I should focus here on the main arguments for and against a NATO membership. In favor of a NATO membership, the strongest argument in the discussion has been that only a full membership in NATO give us the full security guarantees, Article 5 in the and it would also stabilize the Baltic Sea region, because if Sweden join together with Finland, hopefully, it will stabilize the Baltic Sea region, because the Russian would know where Swedish position is. It's not alliance-free, it's part of NATO, and so on and so forth. The main arguments on the opponents of a membership argued that a Swedish NATO membership would in fact destabilize the region, because then we have to expect a more aggressive Russia, more nuclear weapons in the Baltic Sea, on vessels, submarines, and so on and so forth. Sweden will, in other words, be more vulnerable. And also another argument is that since the Swedish position on nuclear weapons since 1968, when Sweden abandoned its nuclear weapons plans, it's been more or less a taboo that Sweden should enter NATO, because NATO is in the end reliable. Maybe not in peacetime, but maybe in a war situation, Sweden might run the risk that nuclear weapons will be placed on Swedish soil, and so on and so forth. So the reasons that we can discuss this, but I think one of the strongest reasons why we submitted this NATO application is that we don't have a strong defense today as we used to have during the Cold War. As I told you, during 1950s and 1960, Sweden was able to mobilize around 700,000 to 800,000 soldiers. Today, roughly speaking, Sweden is 8,000 soldiers. So it's a big difference, of course. And then what we called in Sweden the Finland argument. If Finland joins, Sweden has to follow. And that's the reason why this process was very much done in tandem with the Finnish application and the Finnish process to join NATO. And another reason is, even though we had security agreements with the United States and a couple of other states, there were no security agreements. There were only security assurances. And even though there were some kind of support and some kind of reliance on the support from the United States and other states, it was not considered as full security guarantees that only a NATO membership can guarantee us, so to speak, went the arguments. So I think I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. And I'm sure there's lots of questions, but we'll come around to that later on. Message to the audience. If you have questions, you are welcome to send them through chat function. So I'll see them beforehand and allocate time for that. Both English and Japanese are fine. no Finnish or Swedish, sorry. And we'll see how much time we have left for discussion. So next, Juntinen, please.
Thank you so much. Here discussing on these matters during these quite historic times. I have to agree. I hope you can see my screen. I also try to share it. Yes, everything's good. Okay, so yeah, I'm Tapio Juntunen, working as university instructor in Tampere University, and I actually have a pretty similar approach to the question or the issue than what Thomas did. So I will go back to history a bit, because I think that it's really important to understand certain historical path dependencies or historical trajectories, which perhaps makes it a bit more easy to understand why we have witnessed such a historic and perhaps even a bit unexpected shift in Finnish foreign policy posture during this spring. And I will also try to offer some more immediate reasons, as Thomas did on Swedish side, but on Finnish side, on what were the main reasons, or at least my interpretation of those. So maybe I should also say that I'm in no way attached to any official policy or otherwise. So this is purely my scholarly interpretation, both the historical part and the presence. So I also start from the immediate post Second World War era, and Thomas already mentioned about the Finno-Soviet Treaty of 1948, and we should also add the Paris Peace Agreement of 1947, which limited Finland's foreign policy latitude and also the amount of defense capabilities heavily after Finland had lost a war against Soviet Union in the Second World War. So this is an important kind of structural condition to understand that the Finnish variety of neutralism, I wouldn't even call it as a policy of neutrality, but a kind of aspirant policy of neutralism. It was heavily constrained, as Thomas already mentioned. During Juha Kusti Paasikivi's presidency, Finland was exercising this really kind of constrained, extremely circumspect foreign policy line until 1956, until the so-called Geneva spirit, when the Cold War superpowers had a brief moment of dialogue between them. And actually, during that era, Finland gained accession to United Nations, and then Soviet Union returned Porkkala military base back to Finland. So my interpretation is that it was only after 1956 when you could even discuss about genuine opportunity for some kind of policy of neutralism in Finnish foreign policy, and the previous decade was really constrained international position for Finland. What followed from 1956 was what I would describe a limited peacetime neutralism. As Thomas said, Finnish security position was tied to Soviet Union's legitimate security interest. That was the kind of rhetoric of the era. So through the FCMA treaty, Finland was obliged to defend, together with Soviet Union, an external attack. But at the same time, Finland, of course, maintained its democratic system, Western system. Pascal, do you have something to add?
Tapio, could you put the presentation on full screen?
It isn't full screen yet. Okay, that's quite curious.
We only see the main slide, actually, Finland's path towards NATO.
Okay, so I have to go back then. I think I have to stop sharing for a.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's okay. It's probably my bad. Let's try it again. I will try to put it here. How about now?
In full screen. Wonderful.
Okay, great. And can you see the change of slides now?
Yes, yes, it's
all right.
Thank you.
So I was discussing about the major change in mid-1950s in Finnish foreign policy stance. So Finland was quite heavily constrained in its international space of latitude of movement, and but Finland's under President Kekkonen's generally he's the longest serving Finnish president in history. Finland started to try to open up a bit its diplomatic posture, so towards a bit more active foreign policy posture, and but not in a similar way than Sweden. As Thomas said, Sweden kind of genuinely exercised political neutrality, but Finland was tied towards more constrained idea of not intervening any great power conflicts, but still try to act as some kind of bridge builder whenever it was possible. And Finland also had this, this was not an explicit doctrine, but I would say that Finland, one of main aspirations in Finnish foreign policy was to exercise some sort of regional military disengagement. Of course, Finland also heavily relied on Sweden's neutrality stance. And there was this whole idea of Nordic balance, Denmark and Norway being NATO members, but not allowing nuclear weapons stationed in their countries during peacetime, and Sweden being neutral, and Finland somehow in a precarious position vis-a-vis Soviet Union. So Finland tried to ease up these tensions through some initiatives like the President Kekkonen's initiative to establish Nordic nuclear weapon-free zone, which didn't came true. So now a huge historical or huge step forward in time into the post-Cold War era. So I guess the main takeaway was that Finland was really constrained, and the collapse of Soviet Union was really felt as an opportunity for Western integration in Finland. So in 1990 and 1991, Finland withdrew both from the articles or the military articles of Paris Peace Treaty, and the Finno-Soviet Treaty was replaced with new treaty on the foundations of relations between Russia and Finland. And the latter treaty didn't include any constraints to neither side. So it was really basic state relations treaty. And so one of my arguments perhaps here is that Finland actually never was a neutral country in a strict sense of the word, at least in a sense that we understand it in the Austrian and the case of Austria and Switzerland. There was a brief period of Finland so European Union in 1995, together with Sweden and Austria. And one interesting point, and this is also a difference with Sweden in the 1990s, is that Finland actually gained more space to build military buildup because of the Paris Peace Treaty. Restrictions didn't matter anymore. So Finland actually maintained conscription-based army throughout the post-Cold War year, and I think that there wasn't many states in Europe that did this. Maybe Greece also maintained conscription-based army, and the whole idea of total defense security thinking was really dominant in Finland throughout the 1990s and 2000s, even though there wasn't any like really high threat perception regionally from the Russian side in Finland. The general emphasis in foreign policy at the same time went towards more like issues like global governance and human rights issues and so on. But the total defense doctrine was never really forsaken at this point. And when one thinks about neutrality, Treaty of Lisbon, the basic treaty, European Union, actually already includes not as Thomas says, not like hard security. It's more like security as soft security assurances, and it's also perceived in Finland that this is not enough in terms of providing great power assistance within the region if there is a regional conflict. But nevertheless, Treaty of Lisbon is definitely something that you cannot put into same sentence with the term neutrality, so to say. During Sauli Niinistö's tenure as a Finnish president, Finland started to kind of shift towards understanding the regional region and also in the Arctic region a bit differently, perhaps. Niinistö's policy was based on 4 pillars. It was called this policy of active stabilization. There was the national defense and security structures that were not diminished after the Cold War, drive towards ever deepening Western integration and structures of cooperation, also in defense policy, relations with Russia, like outright unproblematic relations with Russia was also still important and still are actually, and then emphasis on international system, rule-based order, and wider security issues. And here you can already see a major shift from the Cold War era thinking of military disengagement. This quotation is taken from government report on Finnish foreign and security policy, which is the main document kind of that gives the foreign policy line for the next government. It already states that United States military presence within the Baltic Sea region is a stabilizing factor. And this is in the post-2014 world when Russia had already annexed Crimea and had this proxy war in eastern Ukraine. So this is a major shift in thinking. NATO presence in the Baltic Sea region is a stabilizing factor. This is completely opposite than the doctrine of military disengagement during the Cold War period. So you can already see that the shift in thinking had happened before this spring. So there was this gradual practice-driven change in Finnish foreign policy. After the annexation of Crimea, they started to emerge this discourse of NATO option policy in Finland. This was not an explicitly declared policy in government reports. This is something that foreign policy elites and researchers discussed a lot. So it's an implicit doctrine, and it was based on 3 components. First of all, what was important, and mainly because of historical experiences of being constrained during the Cold War era, Finland wanted to maximize the freedom to decide on its own security and defense policy on based of OSCE and UN Charter principles, of course. And this is what rule-based international order is all about also when it comes to like hard security thinking. And this was the practical reasoning in Finland. Also, together with Sweden, pretty much the idea was to build up interoperability with NATO to the extent where should there be some kind of regional crisis which would require military cooperation with Western countries, that the threshold should be as low as possible. So it was a kind of NATO politics, like with defense cooperation, with exercises together with NATO countries, not just in the NATO context, but also bilaterally and multilateral, and also together with Sweden. And if you think about the NATO option, the political message that it tried to send, the NATO option policy was, and this is also my interpretation, that it was meant to signal this latent deterrent effect towards Russia. So there was an implicit message. We won't apply for membership if you commit in maintaining regional stability and on basis of OSCE principles. So, and then there was certain amendments to legislation too, which also kind of removed certain domestic constraints, like law on receiving and giving military aid was was written anew in 2017, and new intelligence laws, for example, were put forth. So here, Finland was already somewhat military aligned, but not military allied. There's an academic debate whether you can make this kind of distinction, because in kind of real world policy terms, Finland was also military non-aligned state. But nevertheless, both are something very different than neutrality in strict sense of the term. I have 2 slides left. I will go fastly through this really momentous spring that we've had. So I think that one of the main reasons, or the main reason actually explicitly also stated by President Niinistö, why Finland actually went on to apply for NATO membership, actually harks back to December 2021, when Putin's Russia made demands for the whole European community that there should be some kind of new written agreement which would forbid new countries to join NATO. And that, from the Finnish perspective, at least from the perspective of Finland's foreign policy elite, undermined Finland's policy of active stabilization, as well as the sovereign right to decide on its defense and security policy. So it was a really principled, kind of against the very basic principles of Finnish foreign security policy, what happened in December 2021. So then Russia invaded Ukraine. President Niinistö visited Biden in Washington, and they had an interesting phone call also with Swedish Prime Minister. There's been close coordination with Sweden, and the Finnish side, both the government and president, has constantly stated that Finland won't join NATO without Sweden. So it's actually some kind of recognizing the legacy that Finnish security was also dependent on Sweden's neutrality during the Cold War, and Sweden gave some assistance to Finland during the Second World War and so on. So there's this historical kind of build-up underneath this cooperation going on. And then there was a signed security pact with the UK also in May. When you go to domestic politics, it's important to understand that this has been at least partly a bottom-up process. It was the public opinion that changed first towards pro-NATO membership, and that was a huge shift, and it happened right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it has remained quite unshaken. It took 2 months' time to have the kind of parliamentary debate that you would expect to have in a democratic state, and it was also in Finland that we have social democratic-led government, just as in Sweden, and the Social Democrats were the key party. So they needed time for internal debate, briefings with the defense forces, and so on. So the formal decisions were made in early May, and it was jointly announced by Prime Minister Sanna Marin and President Niinistö. Actually, just after Sanna Marin had this official state visit in Japan, by the way. This kind of reminds us of the culture of consensus, foreign policy, decision-making consensus culture that is typical of Finland. And it's also important to note that President Niinistö called President Putin straight after Finland's announcement that they will apply for NATO membership. And Putin said to Niinistö that there is no problem what kind of NATO policy Finland and possibly Sweden would have. Maybe Russian leadership already recognized that they cannot anymore have a kind of meaningful intervention into the policy process going on, but they could still have something to say, and Sweden would have within NATO. As we know, it's not just some kind of one size fits all option. So there's negotiation process and so on. And vote in the parliament, as you can see, the result it's historical. Almost only 8 votes against Finnish NATO membership in the Finnish parliament. So quite historical, quite big consensus. To conclude, I think that the key argument here is that the Finnish turn towards NATO was unexpected, but at the same time, when you look back to history, it was also quite some kind of political identity or social identity in Finland. I'm not sure whether Thomas, you will agree on this, but maybe in Sweden, neutrality was more kind of identity based on the kind of national identity, a bit more than in Finland. So maybe that was why Finland was the first kind of the moving operator here. In terms of strategic culture, there has always been this kind of curious mix of Western integration and maintaining credible national defense structure. So the Western democratic societal basic structure, maybe in a third way mode like social democratic politics way, but still nevertheless. And the Cold War experience is key here. Maintaining foreign policy latitude is the key virtue in Finnish strategic culture. And the key turning points here, as I said already, Putin's demands on creating some kind of permanent neutrality structure, which would have led to a de facto sphere of influence kind of arrangement in Europe. This was something that was completely unacceptable from Finnish point of view. And other point, perhaps this is a bit more debatable, was that Putin made this indirect nuclear compellent threat right at the start of the invasion towards Ukraine. And this kind of, there is this term called the stability-instability paradox in nuclear weapons policy research, which basically says that although during the nuclear era, there has been quite few conflicts between the nuclear powers, on the other hand, when you look at the statistics, the nuclear powers have engaged more in conflicts with non-nuclear powers. So there was this idea that maybe the deterrence works only between alliances that rely on nuclear weapons. But this was also implicit. This was not stated explicitly by any Finnish leadership, but one can clearly see that the implications are there. That in order to have some kind of deterrent effect against this kind of nuclear coercion on a regional level, one has to be in an alliance. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. We already have several questions coming in the chat box. For those of you who joined later, if you could send in your questions in the chat, I can better allocate the Q&A session. So now I would like to ask Pascal Lochta to comment, and I should mention that he originally comes from Switzerland, which has come up in both two presentations till now, which has a status of permanent neutrality. And Pascal has been writing and thinking about neutrality at least ever since he joined our PhD course and wrote a thesis about it. And well, Pascal, how do you feel about this whole development, and how do you analyze it?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So maybe I am more biased than the first two speakers, because I do think that this the neutrality concept in Europe has had quite a role to play. And from the studies that I did, for example, and that we are doing together, just also as an information to the audience, I mean, the four of us here are together involved in a book project, right? Looking at how during the Cold War, during the process towards creating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, how the neutral states, Sweden, Finland, but also Switzerland, Ireland, and Austria, interacted with the global community. And, you know, the NPT is, of course, this first huge success story of the Cold War, right? When it comes to creating an arms control mechanism that still works until today. And from what we can see already from the kind of information that we gathered also from Thomas and from Tapio, is that the negotiation position of those neutrals was not unimportant, especially the Nordic neutrals. Sweden and Finland were quite had a key role in the negotiation process at the United Nations level. Very interestingly, though, not necessarily in between. We can maybe talk about that at another instance. But what we see then also later during the Cold War, during the Conference for Security, the Conference for Security and the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, right? The role again that the neutrals played there to make this cooperation happen was quite important. Finland, for instance, because it was during the Cold War forced to be neutral, but neutral on the Soviet side. It was always clear that Finnish neutrality was supposed to serve the Soviet Union. And it is quite clear that that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Tapio, but your long-term political leader, Mr. Urho Kekkonen, wrote several speeches, which a very good editor put into a little book, calling it Neutrality, the Finnish Position. There's a lot of documents that we have that clearly show how Urho Kekkonen understood neutrality as a way of Finland to be independent from the Soviet Union on the one hand, but on the other hand, how this neutrality of Finland has to serve the Soviet Union and the other great power, the United States, in order to create stability in the Baltic area. And in that sense, what you said, I completely agree. Finnish neutrality was meant to create stability, and it was a tool for Finland to gain more freedom to do things in the international community. Not at first. In the 1950s, Finland was busy with other issues of trying to stabilize its political situation, because Finland had this problem that it was on the wrong side of the Second World War, right? After being invaded by the Soviet Union at the beginning of the World War, it then joined the Germans to fight the Soviet Union, and then it was invaded again, right? When the Germans. So it was part of the losers of the Second World War, and out of that then came this treaty that the Finns were forced to sign with the Soviet Union that both of you already mentioned. And that treaty in 1948 that said that if be an attack on the Soviet Union through the Finnish territory, the Finns would have to help the Soviets to defend against that attack, right? And that creates this situation in which Finland is obliged and basically to become a belligerent if it is an attack is happening on the Soviet Union through their territory, but not if anything else should happen. And Kekkonen also put this neutrality as a way to say, like, okay, we make sure that nobody attacks the Soviet Union through our territory, and in general that the stability is here, and thereby we can create security over here. So in this sense, now the Finnish position doesn't surprise me that much, because for Finland, neutrality was never an important part of identity, just as you said, Tapio. It was always a tool to achieve something greater, which, by the way, it also is for Switzerland. But the Swiss foreign policy says very clearly, well, we want this security. Neutrality is a tool to achieve that. But the Swiss have been following that dogma for the last 200 years and have really started believing in it way more than a foreign policy should be ever believed in, right? Because it's at the end of the day, it's still a foreign policy. Now, for Sweden, the situation is different in the sense that Sweden was also during the Second World War neutral and was never forced to sign any such treaty. But Sweden kind of got used to not being part of an alliance, which is, although only partially true, because during the interwar period, Sweden in the 1930s was one of the strong supporters of, and the League of Nations principle of defending League members is much, much stronger than NATO's Article 5. I just, if you have the time, go compare NATO Article 5 and the, I forgot which article it was in the League of Nations document, but the League of Nations document says clearly, if one member is attacked, all other members have to counterattack immediately. Article 5 of NATO says if one member is attacked, then the other members are supposed to help that attacked member, which can include, doesn't have to, can include military measures. So in a sense, Article 5 of NATO is actually, in pure formalistically, still quite a notch weaker than what the League of Nations promise of collective security was. And in the 1930s, Sweden was rallying. It was also drumming up support among the international community. It was the United Kingdom and also France and others that didn't. The United States never committed to the League of Nations, and in the end, only in 1936, once it became clear that collective security in the League of Nations was failing or had failed, Sweden actually went back to its original foreign policy, which was this neutrality position, and the supporter of Swedish diplomatic approach towards the League of Nations was Östen Undén. And Östen Undén was then the one who became a defender of neutrality, but he didn't defend neutrality because he believed in it. He defended it because he saw how collective security failed. And Östen Undén is this very interesting personality in Swedish foreign policy, who then also became a foreign minister and prime minister and stayed in power until after the Second World War. Right? He's one of those figures who kind of crosses this period. And Sweden, in that sense, then stuck after the Second World War to that policy, which worked. And I cannot clearly say whether it is whether this is a generational issue, you know, that then you had this same Second World War generation still in power for at least 20 more years until something time in the 1970s, the late 60s and 70s, détente already started, and in a sense, the process, the necessity for becoming a NATO member also decreased. I'm not sure about that aspect, but I think what both of the speakers said about the importance of history is very, very central. And let me just share maybe one. I don't have slides, but I have this one picture of neutral countries today, you know, in Europe, and what the European map looks like. And maybe we just keep that in mind. There's these different qualities of neutral states today. So the light green ones here, Ukraine and Georgia, are states for which neutrality is proposed as a way of solving an active ongoing conflict. And that proposal comes first and foremost, of course, from Russia, but also from some realist thinkers like Henry Kissinger or Michael Waltz from the US, right, who say that these territories should remain neutral in order to de-escalate the situation, right? But let's ignore these two for a moment, because both of them now have ongoing very bad conflicts and wars, in fact. Then the dark blue ones are the countries like Switzerland, Austria, Moldova, and Malta that actually have neutrality written into their constitutions, right? So these are the only states where the constitution mandates that they remain neutral. And if you wanted to change that, you have to change a constitutional article, which is not impossible, of course, because Ukraine, for instance, also had neutrality as a pillar of its foreign policy in its constitution, and they changed that in 2014. So it's absolutely possible, but that's just here to say that there's a difference. And then the light blue ones over here, Serbia, Ireland, Sweden, and Finland, are states that have written neutrality basically just into their foreign policy documents, right? And among these four here, it really was Sweden and Finland that since the early 2000s basically started little by little deleting the word neutrality from their foreign policy documents, almost literally, and replacing them with other formulas like non-alignment. And what Thomas said is was quite important. You know, this idea, Finnish foreign policy idea, that you maintain non-alignment during peacetime to enable neutrality during war times. This is a smart way of squaring the circle that tensions about neutrality only apply to war times. There is no legal international law requirements for neutrals, what they have to do during peacetime. So all the neutrals actually of Europe had to come up during the Cold War with an approach toward squaring that circle of what you do now in this situation where you have a structural conflict going on, but not necessarily a hot war. And the Swedish solution to that was to say, like, okay, we make sure that we can remain neutral once war starts, which is actually the same position Switzerland is taking, with the difference that the Swedes never actually wrote that into their constitution, right? In this sense, what then happened in the late 90s, early 2000s is that the neutrality aspect, the let's remain neutral during war, that started going away and was then replaced with formulas of non-alignment, etc. And also the cooperation with NATO and the Partnership for Peace. Sweden and Finland both participated quite a lot and actually already started creating interoperability with NATO. So what is happening now surprised me in the sense of how quickly it happened. But in terms of the steps away from neutrality and into an alliance, Sweden and Finland are the ones that I would have expected to be the first ones to take that step, because they were already on the road towards, on the way toward NATO. And of course, then what happened, political shift could also happen and also take root in the general population. Although I must also emphasize that Sweden and Finland decided not to use the political instrument of a referendum to actually really ask, so what's the population's opinion? So this is a parliamentary decision, and the justification is, oh, but our opinion polls show that we have a large support for this. And I'm, as a Swiss, I must say, I wonder if that would hold also under the actual, if the actual question was raised and you had to decide at the ballot box. But that's a different issue. So what I want to say with this picture here is basically just that we are now losing these two neutrals in 2022. We've lost the third one, in fact. The third state that used to have a neutrality article in its constitution and that abolished that article is Belarus. Belarus article said been driven through Belarus. And to me, this, together with the loss of Finland and Sweden, is an increase of the escalation in continent of basically, creating these two hardening fronts, which I hope will not lead to further escalation, because especially now that Finland and Sweden will join NATO, and I think there's no way back at this point. Politically, this is going to happen. I mean, it depends a little bit on what Turkey does, but I think, Turkey will be swayed in the end. This will happen, and we just have to hope that the grand strategy that, alliances bring stability, that works out. I am worried, for instance, about Kaliningrad over here, which is now a lone outpost basically of Russia in the Baltic Sea. I am worried what this will do. But the Baltic Sea is now basically a NATO lake. That's pretty clear. So this changes the entire geostrategic position of Russia, and of course it increases the NATO-Russia border. Although what Tapio said about the Russian perception and also the phone call made from Finland to Russia is also quite true. I mean, Finland has been quite good at communicating its foreign policy to Russia and with Russia constantly. Over the Cold War, there was a constant exchange, and by NATO and creates threat to Russia, that would be quite a big escalation. But if that doesn't happen, if Finland makes sure that itself doesn't become a threat to Russia, then I think the geo strategic situation will stay more or less the same. And I get this hint that that's maybe where Helsinki and Moscow will take it, but I of course that's just a pure guess. The difference to maybe the other two states here, Ireland and Serbia, is that Ireland's neutrality is a child of Irish independence. You know, in the 1920s, the independence from the UK, of course. So I can't really. I'm not sure where this one will be going, but it has kind of a different. Irish neutrality is not a child of the Cold War; it's a child of the independence movement, and Serbian neutrality is a child of the Yugoslav War and of being bombed by NATO. So the Serbs, to the Serbs, this is very much in their collective memory that in 1999 they were bombed by NATO. So although they want to join the European Union, they are very much opposed to joining NATO, that hostile alliance that once bombed them without United Nations mandate, of course. So I will stop it here, and maybe we go then into our discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So we have questions coming in the chat function. We have about 50, and I would ask the audience to, if possible, put their questions in the chat box so I can better structure the remaining time in an efficient way. I think we'll talk in about 4 boxes. One, to talk about what it was like during the Cold War. And then 2, we're going to talk about the transition. I'd like to ask about the transition period between the end of the Cold War and until very recently. Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to say when the transition started until, Russia really got menacing. But there's a discussion out there that it was wrong that NATO expanded in the first place, right? That we should have looked for some sort of non-aligned, non-alliance, or some sort of neutral status for the former Warsaw Pact countries. And it was wrong in the first place to expand the NATO at all. So we're going to talk about that transition period. And then box 3 will be the future of Sweden and Finland. And there's lots of questions here. How much defense spending are you going to put in? Will you station foreign troops, US bases? Will you station nuclear weapons? And are you not afraid joining NATO will make Putin even more angry and make the region even more destabilizing? And then we're going to go into the last box would be the future of European security architecture. I mean, there was something that we thought was some kind of European security architecture, probably in the 70s, and that's what the subject we're working on in our book. Is it all gone now, or does it remain, although it's damaged, and can we reconstruct it? And does Russia have a place in it? So I'll put them in those 4 boxes. So Cold War neutrality or non-alignment, or even we have the word Finlandization, right? And Macron brought it up. So I would like to ask you about how you feel about your past and what's your feeling or your country's mood? Do you feel sad? I mean, we saw Pascal feels sad. I was rather sad to see very clever foreign policy tradition go into a different phase. But I would like to ask how you feel about your past and how you're feeling about your future. From Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much, Yoko. I think you could, what is happening now in Sweden from two time perspectives. If you take a little bit of long-term perspective, maybe the argument that Tapio and I think also Pascal lifted up here in their presentation, it seems to be kind of inevitable process after the Cold War, when especially Sweden scaled down on their defense, and the leading argument in foreign policy circles in Sweden was that, hey, be neutral any longer. There's nothing to be neutral against. Soviet Union doesn't exist any longer. And then the integration into European Union and the abandonment alliance position in practice, even though in theory the Swedish government stuck to that approach. It didn't work. And so in that sense, yes, it could be argued there is some kind of natural process to this. Having said that, I think we shouldn't see this as a kind of automatic process, because there are different important decisions made by different Swedish government that put us in this situation. I personally believe if Sweden had more like defense, we kept our strong defense, and also was more concerned about keeping the non-alignment position, using Swedish security and foreign policy as an instrument, as a bridge builder, support to different kinds of non-bipartisan aid during conflicts and things like that. But all these kind of activities were abandoned. So when in 2014 Russia attacked Ukraine, Sweden was standing there naked, so to speak. But having said that, if we had tried to stick to uphold our more traditional alignment policy with a strong defense, I'm not 100% convinced that we would have joined NATO. But on the other hand, and I think also because today my personal position here, I'm not sure about the best option, but I think it's been handled by the political elite in Sweden in a bad way, because they created some kind of panic. Oh, we have to join now, and it's just going to take weeks, maybe a couple of months. We know today it will probably take longer, and we was not in such a panic that the government, or especially the foreign minister, argumented in lines with we have to move fast. And I think it would have been better if we took a serious discussion, and not just behind closed door, an open and even I think the Social Democrats especially was to that this coming election in September this year, that the NATO membership should be an issue. That would be detrimental from the Social Democratic point of view. So they had their party reasons to have a quick decision before the election. But so I think, and we also know that Russia has problems to defeat Ukraine. I mean, this war, if we can call it a war, I think it's a war, it has not been ended yet. So I think in the near future, it's never been a threat to Sweden's security. So we could take in this time, discuss and analyze this. And then I think a decision either to join or not join would have a more legitimacy among the general public in Sweden. That's the way I see it.
Tapio?
Thanks. First of all, I think I come back to Pascal's. You mentioned that the traditional sense of neutrality was that it was intended to work as a legal instrument during wartime, and that reminded me of certain. If you go back to Finnish government reports on security and foreign policy, I don't know, already in 15 years' time, it was always mentioned there that Finland most likely would not be able to stay outside of regional conflict if one would occur in the near Finnish environment. So that basically is saying other way around, that this kind of conception of neutrality is not possible because of the interdependent role of the I don't know, geographical and geoeconomic space in the Baltic Sea region. And in this sense, it's important to remember that Finland is very dependent on the Baltic Sea maritime route of security of supply and so on. So it's basically an island in that sense. There is no accessible logistical routes from the northern Lapland from Norway and Sweden and so on. So it was maybe the idea it's impossible. Either Finland has to join military alliance or if the present policy is not accepted by Russia, which was based on the active stabilization and military non-alignment. So it was a kind of a fait accompli situation. This is my interpretation of why neutrality as such was not on the table as an option. There was another option, which was deepening defense cooperation with Sweden. But maybe that was realized in bilateral discussions between the governments that this wouldn't be enough. Like that would probably lead to a state defense treaty between Finland and Sweden, which doesn't exist. But it was deemed too lightweight option for NATO. I will pick up also if you don't mind on the future and future of Finland and Sweden in NATO. There was these questions about defense spending and whether they're stationing of US troops and nuclear weapons. Starting with nuclear weapons, Finnish law explicitly rejects the possibility of stationing of nuclear weapons into Finnish soil. It's not an end of discussion because legislation can be changed, of course, but at the moment this is a non-starter. But it's also a non-starter strategically. There's no intention of United States stationing nuclear weapons into Europe. There will probably be a decision in Madrid in NATO summit on stationing conventional troops in Eastern Europe, but we all know how hard political debate there has been for decades now on actually achieving those, and there's no reason for that. And because Finland has quite credible defense forces, for example, second largest field artillery after Russia in Europe, for example, there's no immediate military rationale for stationing permanent troops either. But we will see. Of course, this is a matter of politics, and maybe the next government might be a conservatives-led, different kind of ideas on this, but it's of course not up to us. And I think that if you think about the strategic culture and the history, it would make more sense to have a similar kind of posture than Norway, for example. Norway has dealt bilateral relations with Russia quite successfully as a NATO member. I don't see why we should kind of forsake that tradition from our side. maybe it's something more akin to Norway's posture that will be coming. But of course, this is a matter of the negotiations that haven't even started because of Turkish opposition.
Finland currently spends a little bit more than 1.5% of its GDP on defense. Yeah. Do you think it will aim for 2%?
Yeah, it will actually go to 2% because of the acquisition of the F-35 fighter from the United States. That's a huge, that's the biggest military investment in Finnish history. 64 fighter jets, probably not dual capable. Hopefully, might be a secret because they can be deployed both dual capable and like purely conventional. But that will take it. I think that it will take it even above 2% of the GDP.
I mean, this decision to buy 64 F-35 came even before Russian invasion of Ukraine. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think I can. It was there was a big debate in Finland, but in a way, like political debate on how many planes we need and what does it mean in terms of aerial defense architecture. Not that much about on terms of alliance politics or defense cooperation or interoperability or that kind of thing in public debate, I mean. But the defense forces and defense ministry basically had a really pragmatic, rational and explanation for the decision, and it was a really prudent, several years long process of comparing 5 different Western providers, and it's basically the same amount of fighter jets that Finland has now, the amount of F-18 jets that Finland. So it's basically 1-to-1 replacement, but of course with new capabilities.
Okay. There's also a question about TPNW, Treaty on the ban of nuclear weapons. Can both of you elaborate your position on this and how, yes, well, Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah, I can do that because I headed a working group in Sweden. If we should join the nuclear ban treaty or not in the first. Before that, I can also mention that the Swedish position today is to upgrade, increase the defense budget up to 2%. And also the Swedish position, if we join NATO, is that no nuclear weapon should be placed on Swedish soil and no permanent NATO bases. But having said that, and I've been in the Swedish debate arguing that it's a little bit awkward to discuss and argue and refer to peacetime agreements like Norway and Denmark. In peacetime, no nuclear weapons are allowed to be located on their soil. But if we enter into war, everything will be changed. And if we belong to a security community, you have to accept certain realities, of course. So I'm not so sure about that. Having said that, I think Sweden should do the same as Finland, to have a legislation, national legislation that ban transport of nuclear weapons into Sweden and so on and so forth. Okay, and then the ban treaty. Yes, that Sweden should join the ban treaty, many thought should be an obvious standpoint, given the Swedish traditional disarmament policy. And so the government thought about it, the social democratic government, under the leadership of the foreign ministry, if we talk about this kind of, in the context of the ban treaty, Margot Wallström. But it became, in the internal discussions in Sweden, an issue of relationships with other states, NATO states, especially with the United States. Since we have this agreement with the United States that was in practice 2016, and the defense minister argued that if we enter the ban treaty, will have bad consequences, negative consequences with the United States. And also, one of the arguments, Social Democrats said no support for this position in the parliament, since Christian Democrats argue that we have to be open for a NATO. So that's the reason. So, but this is very awkward if you take perspective, since we abandon our nuclear weapons plans state. That then this argument is so important for especially the present government, that of exceptions regarding nuclear weapons policy has to be involved in the negotiation in the future.
Are you still sending observers to the conference that's going on right now?
That's also very interesting, because that was addressed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Margot Wallström, that we should have an observer. But since then, it's been so unclear we should head in that direction or not. Maybe a decision has been made lately, which I'm not aware of. But as far as I know, I haven't heard about that. A couple of months ago, that was not the position of Sweden anyway, even though we said we're going to do that. So you see, this is a very sensitive issue in Sweden.
No, it's been discussed also in Japan.
Having said that, I think in the end it will be an observer there, of course, because it's not.
Yeah, I mean, Germany has also been very quiet, but I believe they're sending. Okay, Tapio.
Yeah, thanks. I think that Finland is according to my understanding, is sending an observer in the ban treaty review conference. But when the whole process started in 2016-2017, Finland was conservative than Sweden at the start. I think that Sweden actually participated in the negotiation phase in United Nations. Finland didn't even join that, and the argument then was the more pragmatic, or the kind of official explanation was that we do not participate this because we do not see any meaningful chance of something coming out of this. No nuclear weapons will be disarmed due to this process, and we want to preserve the NPT as strongly as possible. And this is something perhaps that you will hopefully read from the book that Pascal is editing and you are editing, because there is some kind of affinity towards the NPT process in Finland due to historical reasons. But of course, once again, in between the lines, you could clearly read that one of the reasons why Finland didn't join or agree with the TPN was because we wanted to maintain the NATO option policy. If you have that kind of NATO option policy also as a latent deterrent, of course you don't do diplomatic initiatives that would undermine your own, let's say, implicit doctrine. That's my interpretation of the process, and I actually have written a scientific article on this, but it's in Finnish, unfortunately. But it's really interesting, and unfortunately, it seems like the whole non-proliferation disarmament landscape is kind of fracturing into various kind of competing sectors. It's really an unwanted direction that this whole thing is going, but that's something that we have to live on with, I guess.
Okay, let's just wind the clock back a little bit and go back to the years around about 92, 93, 94, 95. So we have this debate that had Ukraine stayed neutral, or we'll put aside had Ukraine kept nuclear weapons. I don't think that's a viable topic to discuss. But had Ukraine stayed non-aligned, or had NATO not expanded, or had NATO not included the Baltic states, maybe Russia would not have been so angry that they, maybe Russia feels a little bit more secure had it had this sphere of buffer states or whatever in between. Do you find that argument viable? Who wants to start? Thomas?
I think it's too easy to argue that's the only reason. I think that's a kind of justification on the Russian part and their policy to talk about spheres of influence and so on and so forth. And this is a very strong realist and especially neo-realist point of view, like John Mersheimer had argued in line with those kind of arguments. I think it's some truth in it. At least it has been a part of the Russian strategy in its way to communicate the Russian message to the rest of the world. But I would argue you also have a strong other motivation, and even stronger, I think. I think that Russia is afraid of Ukraine being more and more integrated into the European economic democratic sphere. And that is considered as a threat, maybe even stronger than this kind of spheres of influence and the NATO enlargement in a sense. Because if Ukraine will be successfully integrated into Europe and become a blooming economy with strong democratic institutions and so on and so forth, that will be even a bigger threat on Russia and in their way to deal with other neighboring states to Russia. On the other hand, of course, these two kind of arguments integrate into each other in a sense, but I think it's too easy to say it's just about NATO enlargement, I think.
Was there any concept at any time of sort of a bigger Nordic Union or something with the Balts and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians inside?
After the Cold War, you mean?
Mm.
No, not in real terms. Of course, there were some discussions among, as Tapio referred to, Finnish, Swedish cooperation and things like that. And also Clinton approached Sweden to take a bigger responsibility for in the Baltic Sea area in regards to the Baltic states and things like that, but nothing more than that. So that was not on the table in a realistic.
Pascal?
Thank you. I just wanted to chime in here about the question you asked before, because on my part, I believe that argument that you laid out before, and what Thomas showed to us is like quite nicely how there is this question of interpretation and the question of what does Russia think. So is Russia afraid of democracy, which is basically the liberal argument of what's going on, or does Russia understand foreign policy in hard realist terms? And on the one hand, Russia tells us quite clearly that they have the realist interpretation. Mr. Lavrov literally cites John Mersheimer. He does in his press conferences. They're like, okay, Mr. Mersheimer gets us, understands us. That's one. The other thing is that if you look at other parts of the world, how Russia acts, look at Mongolia. It's always interesting to look at the places that are not a problem in order to kind of create an analytical difference, right? So Mongolia in 2015 at the United Nations declared that it wants to be a neutral state. And Mongolia used to be in Asia what Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria were. It was not part of the Soviet Union. It was a satellite state, and clearly under the control of the Soviet Union. And the Mongolian diplomats, retired diplomats today, remember that, and they say like, yeah, it is like the Soviet Union treated us like this tiny little junior partner who has to take its orders. And today, Mongolia is clearly forming its own independent foreign policy, also on neutrality, and it is democratizing. And Mongolia has democratized rapidly over the 30 years. And it's actually not just a mock democracy, it's actually doing quite well. It's having a multi-party system, and it's changing its own constitution, but it's like powers going back and forth. And Russia just accepts that. And China, by the way, too. So here we have an example of a successful buffer state, and it has nothing to do with being democratic or not. It has to do with the fact that they serve a purpose of de-escalating also the conflict between, or conflict potential between Russia and China. And Mongolia is always in a very geostrategic place that also caused a lot of problems. Now here we have no problem. In Eastern Europe, we have a problem. And the second reason why I believe that is that a lot of very eminent Russia scholar experts in the West actually have that interpretation. So I interviewed Jack Matlock, the last Soviet ambassador to the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union. And he said it is absolutely clear that this NATO expansion was a mistake. And several US ambassadors said so, this is a mistake. And we know that Ukraine had a key issue to Russia, and if Ukraine was ever considered as a way to deploy NATO, then Russia would have to react, and that's exactly what happened. Also, if you look at 2014, which is not to say that it is okay. It's not okay to invade a country. It's not. It's just this was predicted, and then the prediction came true. So I would believe the interpretations of the realist school on this matter.
This question is not closed yet, okay? Because was it yesterday or the day before? Macron, Scholz, and Mario Draghi travels to Kyiv, and they promise EU membership, but says not a word about NATO membership of Ukraine. So, what future for Ukraine? Okay, Finland and Sweden gets into NATO probably. Will there ever be around for Ukraine joining, or what future for Ukraine do you feel is the best? And I'll go to Tapio first, because I'm reading this book by Marisa Rotte, in which President what's his name, Ahtisaari, comes along and says, "Don't rush. Think about the Russians. Maybe the Baltics joining NATO will be too much." So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Straight after his tenure as a president, Ahtisaari advocated Finnish NATO membership in 2002 or something like that. So one wonders what has really been on. But yeah, there's this debate on what I think that what Finnish leadership discussed with Clinton was also the fact that Finland, the option that Finland would take more responsibility also from Baltic defense, because Finland actually assisted, for example, Estonian defense forces in the early 1990s and so on, but it was a bit too heavy step to take. So I guess it was also somewhat realistic, because they needed to organize their defense policy. It couldn't just rely on some political guarantees and that kind of stuff. That was not the experience of the Baltic states. Their experience, we have to kind of respect what was their historical experience within the Soviet Union. And this is the same thing. I don't want to explain what the Ukrainians should do or what should happen. We should ask the Ukrainians what they want. This is the basic principle of OSCE. The Eastern European countries joined NATO. NATO didn't, on my perspective. This is a bit provocative comment. NATO didn't just like expand towards the east. They wanted to join. And it was also about societal security, pretty much. It was not that much about hard security in the 1990s. It was also a way to integrate them into some kind of democratic group of nations. Of course, European Union came side by side with that. Of course, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, no permanent troops stationed. So clearly there was some kind of security dilemma sensibility in the enlargement process already included. So if we go beyond that and we really go into counterfactuals we start to speculate that what would the European security order look like without the NATO enlargement? Would that somehow appease Russia, or would there have been some kind of internal forces that would cause some conflicts with the border zones? That's the kind of speculation that I don't want to go into.
Thomas, you can comment on that, but I just want to add a question. Did Sweden feel safer with NATO, even during the good times like 1992-95?
Yeah. Okay. First, I would like to on what Pascal said, and I didn't mean that the security issue, enlargement of NATO membership, had no whatsoever influence on the Russian position, but I think it's to simplify to argue it's the only reason. I think it's also economic reasons. If Ukraine and other countries close to Europe, belonging to, so to speak, the Russian sphere, are more integrated into Europe, I think. But leave that aside. We don't know about the future anyway. But then what Ukraine should do, I think we're just in the really long process. Even though Ukraine is a so-called European Union candidate, it can take years. It can take decades before, if ever, Ukraine. Depends what's going to happen. If you in the long and things like that, and of course, the reaction from European Union and from NATO and from the United States will be analyzed step by step and see what is possible to do. However, I think the cooperations, in a sense, the ties with Ukraine will be there, if not Russia with swallow. But I think in the short run, a NATO membership is out of question for Ukraine, and also a membership of European Union, but maybe in the future. But we will see about that. And Joko, your question about the NATO discussion and the debate in Sweden in the beginning of 1990s, but at that time, once again, the situation, Swedish point of view in Europe, in security-wise, was that any conflicts in the near future, and we are, in fact, new security architecture. So there's no to join NATO. There were some parties and certain key individuals in certain parties that Sweden should join NATO, but it's not a big issue in Sweden at that time. Okay. And I can tell you, I mean, just for a couple of years ago, in the Social Democratic Party pamphlets in elections and so forth, it was taken for granted that the Swedish non-alignment will be there forever. Is timeless, this security policy situation. I mean, and it's just a couple of years ago. So no, I mean, the support for the non-alignment policy was very strong during the 1990s in Sweden. Even though we were not against NATO would enlarge, and we understood from the Swedish perspective that the Baltic states and other Eastern European states have to decide themselves if they want to join. We were not against that.
Yeah, well, I know from, I've been in and out of NATO headquarters during the 90s, and I know there was reluctance and for and against about expanding. And I know Ukraine was always a special country somehow, even looked from the NATO. So, if the Ukrainians themselves had wished to become another big Sweden, in that position, it would have been best for probably everyone. The problem is that they never wanted that. They seem to. So, you can't sort of force them to become neutral. You need a strong, supported and strong commitment to defend yourself if need be, I guess, to remain a wartime neutral. Pascal, there's a question, I think, about the concept of do you see that in Japanese?
Yes, but
whether wartime neutrality is still valid even after war has been illegalized.
That's a very good question. It was illegalized through the Kellogg Pact in the 1920s, and there was a very strong argument that this pact then superseded the whole law of neutrality. The whole that it superseded the whole law of neutrality, but in the end, the fact that war always remained, even though war was outlawed by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, by the League of Nations, and by the United Nations, war is illegal. We always have wars, unfortunately, and so by the fact of war, then the fact of neutrality kind of also remained around. That's also like how Sweden and Finland understood the situation for a long time. May I just add about Ukraine? One thing is quite important here. Ukraine had a neutrality article in its constitution in 2014, and then it got rid of it after Crimea was invaded and annexed. But the timeline here is really, really important. Between 1991 until 2014 in Ukraine, you had changes of government that were like rather pro-Russian or pro-European Union. And the government that was in power in 2014 was a rather pro-Russian government that decided not to sign the association agreement with the European Union. And then the color revolution on the Maidan happened. The democratically elected president Yanukovych was chased out of the country, and a new government came to power that actually said we will now aspire for NATO membership. And that's the moment when then in early spring 2014 Russia decided to invade Ukraine, to invade Crimea and take that port, which they already held before, because Khrushchev mistake of like giving Ukraine from the Russian Federation to the Ukrainian SSR, right? Crimea used to be part of the Russian SSR and then was given to the Ukrainian one because it's easier to administer. Because Crimea was something like Northern Ireland in the European Union. As long as Ireland and the UK are both part of the European Union, Northern Ireland is not. The problem is solved. Crimea was solved as long as the Ukraine and and Russia were in the Soviet Union. But as that split up, the Black Sea port remained a Russian port. But the moment it actually happened that this 2008 offer of NATO that Ukraine and Georgia can join in the future, the moment that became a reality, that's the moment when Russia decided to not take its chances and invade. That then upsets the entire electoral balance in Ukraine, between being pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. Then you've got the two eastern Ukrainian regions that try to split off, which upsets the balance even more. And now the rump state of Ukraine is clearly pro-European, and you don't have a majority anymore for a neutrality. So if we talk about what is the will of the Ukrainians, we need to ask, so which Ukraine? Ukraine now, Ukraine before 2022, or Ukraine before 2014, and the electoral balance inside there. And that's, I think, now we are completely in the hypothetical realm, but it's important to keep that in mind when we discuss what's the will of the Ukrainians.
So we were hearing our end, but there's also another question in the box about Sweden taking Finland's position into consideration and therefore not joining the NATO during the Cold War. Can you elaborate on this point a little bit? And I would add a question. Is it possible that Sweden remains outside NATO even though Finland joins? That was an option. Thomas.
Okay. Yes, this is called the Finland argument in Swedish foreign policy debate. Yeah, once again, the argument went like, if Sweden should join NATO during the Cold War, that would put Finland in a very vulnerable situation and run the risk that even Finland could be swallowed by Russia, because then the Sweden, and not only Sweden, but NATO came closer to Russia, and the rather kind of soft policy, Russia's policies towards Finland would be much, much harder. Therefore, the Swedish standpoint will always, so the argument went, take into consideration Finland and Finland's geopolitical situation, neighbor to Russia, and the Nordic balance, because one argument that supported this standpoint was that United States, at least from the second half of 1950s onwards, were very pleased with the situation with the Nordic balance, and Sweden had a rather strong defense system, as I told you, could mobilize between 700,000 and 800,000 soldiers, have a very advanced air force, and so on and so forth. And on top of that, we know today, because of historical research, a lot of secret cooperation with the United States. So that if Sweden should join NATO, first of all, we put Finland in a bad, vulnerable situation, but also would rock the boat for the Nordic balance in the northern part of Europe, so to speak. So that was the argument. But of course, there were other arguments. The vision of non-alignment in Sweden almost became it became an identity, especially during the Cold War. It was more or less a part of our DNA. And we, if you compare Norway and Denmark that joined NATO, we saw itself as not only as a survivor from the Second World War, but also argued that was a successful policy. So the Swedish neutral position were supported by all parties in Sweden, even the Conservative Party, not only the Social Democratic shortly after the Second World War. So that was taken for granted that we continued our, non-alignment position. So, but I think the Finnish, the Finland's argument, so to speak, was rather strong. And after the Cold War, at least was used in the debate in Sweden. Hey, don't forget what we argued during the Cold War. We are very tied to Finland. We're still very tied to Finland. So what's taking place in Finland, we have to take into consideration. So if Finland joins, we have to join as well. So the argument went, so to speak.
Okay.
But on the other hand, of course, we could have said, yes, we stay out of it, NATO, even if Finland joined. But it's not going to happen. But everything is possible. I'm not saying that it's some kind of natural laws in foreign policy. I mean, different kind of position. I'm not so super sure that it's some kind of inevitability built in this process. Not at all.
Yeah, can I also add? Yeah, I totally agree with Thomas on the last point that you cannot predict the future on basis of what is happening now. Politics and international politics, especially, it's an art of possibilities and so on. But what is reality right now is going back to the last question you made, is that Finnish foreign policy leadership at the moment has quite explicitly stated that Finland won't join without Sweden. That's an articulated, and then there's this historical reasons behind that. But would there be such an I don't know, unexpected event that Sweden would like also willingly stay out of NATO, then that would maybe change the situation. But that's something that we cannot see in the horizon right now.
Okay, so I will go to the last question from me, and maybe Pascal, you also want to comment on this. So, what kind of future for the European security architecture? How bad is the damage, and how are we going to repair this? I can sort of imagine in the coming months that some of the European powers would argue for ceasefire, bring back the OSCE, and go back to the Minsk agreement. Now, would that wind the clock back and put things normal, back to business again, with Russia again at the table? Where do we pick up the pieces, and how do we try to rebuild European security architecture? Thomas?
Wow, not an easy question. It's so difficult to say. Most of international experts today arguing we won't go back to what the world we lived in before 24th of February. Maybe not. But I'm not so sure. I mean, it depends how, so to speak, successful Russia will be in their aggressions. And it doesn't, not right now at least, that they are so efficient. The Russian war machine is not so efficient that we expected half a year ago. So it's hard to tell, but I think at least it's a new situation, and we have discussed here is for sure Finland will join NATO, and they're going to be stronger ties between European Union and Ukraine, but what that will take us is so difficult to say. But I think in the long run, of course, some kind of relations have to be upheld with Russia, but in what way? It's so difficult. So I'm not willing to speculate further than this. In fact,
do you still see a future for OSCE?
Not really.
Yeah, it all seems rather bleak at the moment, and it's hard to imagine what will come next, because what will follow from the situation right now, I cannot imagine it being based on what is already there or what was there before December 2021. Something different, something has to happen. But maybe one can, I don't know, soothe oneself by looking history. In the early 1970s, D10T was followed after quite intensive crisis between the superpowers, Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. Euro Missile Crisis was followed in just 2 years with huge breakthroughs in arms control negotiations and dialogue between the great powers. So I think that this is quite great power-centric perspective, perhaps, but it's a possibility that something quite unexpected will happen. But I think that when doing these kind of analogical comparisons to history, the worst part is that you need a major crisis before something new comes out, and we have to include China as a third kind of great power competitor. So it's a multipolar, more complex environment than the bipolar system we used to have in the Cold War period. But maybe that's at least some kind of comforting idea that that crises have been followed by a period of dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Pascal, Swiss has been watching the great powers come and go. What do you say now?
Well, the sad thing is we don't have a security architecture in Europe at the moment. We have an insecurity architecture, and at the moment the spiral is going in the direction that I don't like. It's going towards more confrontation. It's going towards less collaboration. The OSCE at the moment is in a really sad state that it hasn't even been mentioned, and the demand of Russia in December to actually to sit down and discuss European security jointly and hammer out an rejected. So I think there is at the moment in NATO headquarters and also pretty much the view is no talking. So although I think what we need in Europe right now very badly is a CSCE process. Second CSC, maybe not even the OSCE, but the second process of negotiating and creating a structure that includes Russia. But at the moment, the idea is if we do that, then Russia wins, and Russia can win. Therefore, we cannot do that. So it's really, the whole security logic at the moment is extremely sad and is very belligerent, in fact. And people who argue against weapon deliveries for Ukraine are being touted as being supportive of Russia, which is not the thing. The thing is we have this small continent, and on that one you need to create some form of understanding of how to interact with each other, even when the others don't really play along. Now at the moment I don't think we're in a positive spiral. What I wonder is what's going to happen once the other superpower does something that we in Europe don't like. So right now we have Russia who does something we really don't like, which is the invasion of Ukraine. But let's not forget that in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, and that Libya was bombed without UN mandate, and that we have still a potential for a war between NATO members and Iran. That one is not from the table either. The Middle East is still very unstable. So if there is another horrible situation in the Middle East, and this time it is the other part that behaves in a way that a majority of Europeans, just like in the Iraq war, disapproves of. I wonder what that would do to the alliance, and also then to this problem of entrapment, which is now created for Finland and Sweden. But again, this is purely hypothetical. But judging from just the last 20 years, those were not peaceful years. The last 20 years were quite brutal, especially in the Middle East. And if something else happens, that would again, I think, impact the security logic on the continent.
Okay, so it's already time now, and I have to close this session. I think there's a lot still remains to be discussed, but I think it really helped because we're far away from Europe. Well, we still, we have become closer. I was surprised by how much Japanese people actually sympathize with the Ukrainians in this crisis. There's been a very strong reaction and a very stable support for the government policy aligning itself with the NATO countries and G7 countries. So the support has been very strong until now. In all countries, I see a little bit waning of support, partly because of economic problems that's coming. So I don't really know which way we're going. We will be seeing in a matter of a week or so, NATO leaders in Madrid lined up and giving out a proclamation of some sort. But I guess that's only one step in the long future that we're going to take. And so thank you, Thomas and Tapio, for joining us today in giving us a sense of what you are feeling from your corner of the world. And I really hope we remain in touch and we have opportunity again to discuss and exchange our views. And thank you, Pascal, for giving your point of view. And I think this session was even richer because you had a slightly different viewpoint to give. Thank you, all of you, and I will close the session here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye.